Week 4 of a study we're calling 10 Questions to Diagnose Your Spiritual Health. And there's a book that we've mentioned before by the same title by Donald Whitney, and we're using those questions that he asks, and we're jumping from those questions and we're saying, okay, so how is it that we need to investigate whether we're actually growing or not? So we've asked questions like, do I still grieve over sin? Does sin still cause me to weep? Do I grieve? Or am I getting callous to it? Am I increasingly concerned about the needs of others, both the spiritual needs and their temporal needs? Am I growing in my awareness of what they need? And last week, Pastor Nathan walked us through the question, do I thirst or hunger more after God than I used to? Is that increasing in my life? Because this process of sanctification is that we should be becoming more like Christ. And so if we're not increasingly changing in these ways, then we want to diagnose where it is that we're holding back. What are the things that are distracting us from it? So tonight, Dr. Nanikin's coming to ask the question, am I more loving than I was before?
Good evening, church. Good evening. It's good to be back after spring break. I was talking to Pastor Jeff there at the back, who's a grandpa again. He said he didn't know if it was a boy or a girl, so he didn't know if he was grandpa or grandma. And I had to clarify. He seems to have an air of confidence that he walked where Jesus walked last week. I just told him, I'm glad you didn't die like Jesus died there, you know. Anyway, a lot of us are back from spring break, and I am really excited about this series that's so much devotional but also introspective. Is it I, Lord? Times, particularly this week, to ask that question in terms of introspection. Diagnosis is very important. We often think there's a problem with others, and I'm so glad, even as I went through this lesson by Don Whitney, I learned to ask, Lord, am I growing in love? I'm glad my wife is not here to answer that question. Oh, dear. I'm reminded of this guy who told his wife, he says, I think you have a hearing problem. The wife said, no, I don't. He says, why don't you go and get a checkup? You may have a hearing problem. She wouldn't go. And so eventually he went to the doctor. He says, listen, I don't know what to do. My wife has a hearing problem. So he said to him, he said, what's her hearing range? He said, well, what do you mean range? Well, he says, how far can she hear? He says, I don't know. He said, why don't you go home and test it, find out her hearing range. So he goes back home. He stands right there at the door, and he can see her cooking in the kitchen. He says, honey, I'm home. Nothing happened. She's just doing what she did. So he goes to the living room and he says, honey, I'm home. Still she doesn't move or do anything. Now he goes right into the kitchen and he says, honey, I'm home. And she still doesn't turn. So he goes right next to her neck and says, honey, I'm home. And she says, for the fourth time, what do you want? So I think this diagnosis is more for us, and I hope that when we talk about this whole matter of love, we don't actually think, well, are these people more loving? Is our church more loving? You know, nobody loves me. I'm going to eat worms and die. I mean, I hope we come to a point where we say, like the disciples said to Jesus, Lord, is it I? Is it I? So there's several things. I haven't followed the outline very strictly, and I've actually tried to elitter my points to put it in the same words so I can remember what I'm saying this evening. So I thought I'll walk us through this passage on several grounds. So first of all, I want to make a statement that the criteria, the distinguishing mark that we are Jesus' followers is that we love. Is that we are loving. Well, let me go back and say, do you remember in John chapter 13, that wonderful time on Maundy Thursday, where Jesus, who is supposed to be Lord and Master. He comes, he's so tired, and comes for this meal, and everybody goes and sits down, and they're ready to eat. And as you know, in the Middle Eastern, we actually slouch, we kind of recline. So actually one person's foot is in another person's face almost. So they usually wash their feet. And everybody's hungry, so tired, they come and start ready to eat. And Jesus does something amazing. He demonstrates love. He leaves the table, he takes a towel, and as a supplier, a waiter, he goes, and with this basin, he begins to wash the feet of his disciples. You remember that? And then he makes a tremendous logical statement. He said, listen, you call me Lord and Master, you got that right. And he says, if I, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet. Now what does logic say? I washed your feet, you must wash. Is that what Jesus says? He says, no, if I washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. And in John chapter 13 and verse 34, he clarifies it categorically, and he says, by this shall all people know that you are my disciples if, what? You take baptism and church membership, if you love the Puritans, if you preach Reformed theology. Listen, you know what he says? He says, by this will they know you're my disciples. Not by anything else, but by your love that you show for one another. The way you reflect and reciprocate agape love. That distinguishing mark, that criteria for Christianity is the theme of our discussion. Am I loving? And in this whole process of sanctification, am I growing, developing in my love? More love for thee, O Christ. More love for thee. Some of you may remember that old hymn. I used to listen to Back to the Bible where a long time ago we had the preachers, and before that, love to tell the story would be more love for thee, O Christ. Several other verses to underline and iron into our minds both the matrix in which love is spawned, but also the content of love and the core virtue that is non-negotiable for us as Christians. Someone came in a very critical sense, asked Jesus in Matthew chapter 22, which is the greatest of all commandments. You remember that? He was there to trick and trap Jesus, and Jesus said, well, thou shalt what? Love the Lord your God. Shema Israel. You're going to love the Lord. Here, listen, get this. With all your heart and soul and mind and strength, with everything you've got. And he said, the second is like unto it. It's attached to it. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I see that very important, particularly this week as we admit that the cross of Christ, that love shed abroad, has two arms to it, a vertical arm and a horizontal arm. That is how love is demonstrated. Again, I want to bring up a few other verses to show that this love is not only the greatest commandment, it is precisely how we fulfill all the other commandments. How do you know that? Because Paul says in Galatians 5 and verse 14, which James actually sums up again in James chapter 2 and verse 8, he says, this is the royal love, the kingly way in which you demonstrate you are part of the kingdom. What is it? In one word, thou shalt love your neighbor. So you see that reciprocity where we receive, we love him because he first loved us. And it is that love shed abroad on our hearts, in our hearts, by the Holy Spirit, Romans 5 and verse 5, that literally overflows when we love others and shows the world that we belong to Christ. We are part of his family. Should I really highlight one of the most favorite chapters in the Bible? And you ever wonder why Paul sandwiched chapter 13 between chapter 12 and 14? Nyanakin, that comes in sequence. I know that, but why did he do that? Well, in chapter 12, they are messed up with spiritual gifts. They're not only charismatic, they are schismatic. And in chapter 14, he irons it out and he says, this is how you got to do it, diplomatic. And that's why he sandwiches chapter 13 between chapter 12 with all the problems and the solution in chapter 14. He says, listen, if you speak in tongues of men or even of angels, but you do not have love. If you have the gift of prophecy and you can understand all the mysteries, and you do not have. If you even give your body to be burnt, but you do not have love as the motive, you are nothing. That's pretty strong, isn't it? He not only shows us the central virtue that augments itself in the Greco-Roman world above everything else, but beyond the virtue of love, he shows us the value that is eternal, that it endures forever, beyond faith, because we're going to see him. Why would we need faith? Beyond hope, because hope will be realized one day, but love will endure forever. The greatest is love. Do we love? Do we love like Jesus loved? Again, to talk about the core and the content of divine love, I think it's so important because today love is so ambiguous. I love pizza. I hope I have some tonight. I love that dress that I'm going to get for my wife for Easter and her birthday. I love my grandmother. I love mutton biryani. And I love Jesus. And you're thinking, what is love? Sounds like a song to sing. What is love? It is in this, I want to continue with a few verses. Again, I'm actually presenting these verses. I presume most of us know the context in which these verses are hewed out of. But he says, if you love me, you will what? You will do what I tell you to do. You will keep my commandments. Just to say, love and obedience are riveted together, go hand in glove. If we say we love God and we do not do what he says, it's a problem. I actually found out how to love God. It's very similar to how I should love Dorothy. Can I give you the secret of how to love your spouse? You need a double PhD to figure this out. So let me slowly explain this. I found out the way you love your spouse, number one, you find out the things she wants you to do, and Nike, just do it. Number two, you find out the things she does not want you to do, don't do it. Just say no. And she'll love you. That's not very different. How do we love God? Find out what he wants us to do and what? Nike, just do it. Find out what he doesn't want and just stay away from it. It's not rocket science. If you love me, Jesus said, you will do whatever I've commanded you. And John reminds us, John the Beloved, he says, this commandment is not something new. It's what we know from the very beginning. And John's beginning for Logos is the same as the beginning by which God actually created all things. He said, you must love one another. You must obey. Why? Because when you do what I've commanded you, that is how we know you abide, you remain, you dwell in your love. A few who are here came with me to Nepal, Himalayas. And I feel very sad for them. Due to the weather, they went and I went the previous day with my brother. We chartered Buddha Airways, and we actually saw Mount Everest. We're about half a mile away. It's just breathtaking, on top of the world. And Himalayas, the word Himalayam. Hima is the word in Sanskrit for snow. Nilayam means home. So Himalayas means it's the abode or the home of snow, because always there's snow. And I thought to myself, that's precisely how the love of God should always be characterized in our doing, in our being. This is how we abide in love. I find Paul clarifying a lot of things to the church at Thessaloniki. They were confused. They thought Jesus had come and gone, whether they missed the boat or whatever. And Paul clarifies among everything else. He says, listen, what you really need is what you first had, is love. And he loved you. He gave himself for you. And he's coming back to get you. So we can wait, we can have hope because we have love. And how do you know that? I love this little phrase, because you have been taught by God. Pedagogically, God not only demonstrates his love, he teaches us how to love, because we don't, we can't. Again, we're kind of shifting to what is the true nature of love. I like what Peter says. Peter has a lot of injunctions and exhortations in 1 Peter chapter 1. And in verse 21, he comes to this list and he said, but above all. And, you know, when you read something like that, you pause and you say, what do you mean above all? What do you mean above all? And it reminded me of my headmaster when I grew up in this school. And he would say, listen, above all. And people are like, above all what? That kind of signals his stop. Listen, this is it. This is priority one. This is non-negotiable. This is the essential. And I'll end with Peter, because Peter had a love problem. And so he says, listen, whatever else you do or don't do, above all, keep loving. Keep loving one another. And do it earnestly, sincerely. I like the writer to the Hebrews, and you remember the writer to the Hebrews is trying to, again, meander and kind of navigate and negotiate all kinds of things. And he says, listen, what you need to do as the new community of faith, whether Jew or Gentile, find ways in which you can stir up one another. Or provoke, Paul says. Stir up one another to love. But notice how he couples it, not just love, but love and what? Good works. Last weekend, I was invited by the mullah of the largest mosque in America, at Dearborn, Michigan, to go inside the mosque and give a lecture on fasting in the Abrahamic traditions. So I took it. I said, all right, I'll come. And I had the privilege to go and have that wonderful iftar dinner after they had the Ramadan fasting and share a little about the importance of fasting in the Abrahamic tradition. But I also sat with Muhammad Abuddin and talked to this mullah. And one of the things I left lingering in his heart is, listen, I said, did you know that we love God and we can actually have a relationship with God because God demonstrated his love through Isa Masih, to Jesus. And he's not the Messiah just for the Jews. He loved the world. That's you and me. So I got to kind of put in the little gospel thread to this guy. I mean, this is a Shiite mosque, and it's like the largest. Friday, again, they invited me in Ashburn and Sterling, which is the second largest mosque in America. And it was election time, so they had everybody from Northern Virginia, the Democrats and Republicans. We went inside the mosque, and we had to just share about, ecumenicity. We're all working together. And I was representing the Christian community. I've got to say, I had to clarify that we're not all kind of loving and equal and believe the same things. I showed them how our God, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, he actually is love. Allah requires allegiance. God doesn't. Did you know that? Why doesn't God need us to love him and yet be reciprocal in his love? Because he's Trinity. Between the Father, Son, and the Spirit. The divine drama itself is love. Divine. All loves excelling. It's very interesting to talk to our Muslim friends because they don't understand the intimacy of agape love, self-emptying sacrificial love. Anyway, this love is also good works, and I had another conversation in the Sterling Mosque about whether love and where there's grace and law and good works come together. And I must hasten to say, I think we as Christians, and especially evangelicals, we've so kind of shipwrecked on grace and we're stranded on sovereignty that we think like, I'm saved and I'm sound asleep and I don't have to do anything now. I've got an advance booking in heaven and a fire escape from hell. Listen, I think we may be justified by faith alone, but we will be judged by our good works, the bema seat. So that's why I think love and good works is an evidence. It's an expression that we have the love of God, is that we do good works. We'll come more to that. But to be continued, as it were, for the writer to the Hebrews, he says, listen, I don't need to keep telling you, please love one another. He says, just live in love, walk in love, step by step. Let brotherly love continue. All of us know John 3:16. What is 1 John 3:16? 1 John 3:16, not John 3:16. 1 John 3:16. Yes. I mean, we all know John 3:16. But listen, 1 John 3:16 is where we have the definitive demonstration of divine love. This exclusively and precisely is how we know what love is. Well, how? How do we know what love is? Because Jesus laid down his life for us. And we ought to, because of that, lay down our lives in love for one another. You know, the love of Christ, Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 14, the love of Christ constrains me. This week I was reading a clipping from an old newspaper article. And it was about two sisters who lived across the railway tracks in this little country town. And these two sisters used to play, and one day when they were playing, the train was coming, and so they had to run back to their home. And so they come and they cross, and one of the sisters got her leg caught in the railway tracks, the crossing. And she tried to pull it out, and she couldn't pull it out. And so the other sister comes, and she's trying to help her, and she couldn't. And by the time the article said the train came, and both sisters were killed. But the caption in the next day newspaper kind of caught my attention and gripped my heart. This is what it read. Two sisters die on the railway tracks. One was held by her foot, and the other was held by love for her sister. I thought that was amazing. How do we know what love is? Love lays down its life. Jesus used that as the distinguishing feature between the Old Testament and the leaders who were thieves and robbers who come to steal and murder the sheep. And he says, I'm the good shepherd, right? John 10, verse 11. Why? How do you know Jesus is the good shepherd? The good shepherd what? Lays down his life for his sheep. Love is a verb, not a noun. It's something you do. It's something we demonstrate that is nothing less than love divine. All loves excelling. So we think of this whole aspect of the character of love, and there are some conditions, but we're looking at love today, and I want us to notice how much we have gone astray. We have deteriorated. This decline of love. We need a love check this evening. Is my love growing colder? Am I continuing in this brotherly love? So I want us to do something a little different this evening. I want you to turn to the person next to you or one or two people and honestly just share. We're a family here at Heritage. Share with the person next to you, what are some symptoms that you know that your love is waning cold, that is waxing, that you feel you're losing that fervency, that first love for Jesus? What are some indicators? What's symptomatic? You know, I know I'm getting a cold when two things happen. My voice becomes very coarse, and the other thing is I feel a little bit feverish. And I said, Dory, is it cold? She says, it's not cold. I said, I don't know, I just feel a little feverish. She says, oh, you're getting a cold. You know what I'm saying? There are some symptoms, and you can be honest, you can be one another. I mean, I'll tell you what, I know my love is waning and cold personally when I recently haven't shared the gospel with someone one-on-one. Like on the flight, I'm so tired, and I'm asking, whoa, this last week, I spoke in all these big meetings, but who did I personally witness to? For me, that is a parameter. For me, it's a criteria. It's a gauge. I'm just talking about myself. That's because of my calling. And I can be so caught up with preaching and teaching and all these conferences that I lose my one-on-one soul winning. I'll be honest with you. That, for me, is a check. Now, turn around, take 2 minutes, 1 minute each, and tell them, what are symptoms that you feel like, I don't know, I think my love gets cold. When? Or I sense because. God, you can talk in church now. What are some symptoms of love growing cold? All right, for time's sake, let me see. One or two of you like to share? Just lift your hand up and shout out in the direction. We are family here. All right, yes.
Things out of duty, not because we love the person or the thing or whatever we're doing. It's because we do it because we know that's what we're supposed to do.
Okay, here's a very good indicator. We do things for someone surely merely out of duty, mechanically. There's no heart in it. Very good, thank you. How about this section? You know your love is because, yes.
Slow to forgive. I have to kind of talk myself into it, remind myself that I'm supposed to, as opposed to it flowing naturally, or as soon as I realize that I've offended or done something, quickly address it.
Very good, thank you so much. That attitude where you're ready to forgive. You don't hold grudges. You don't have to convince yourself as what's the rationale. Why do I need to do this? Very good. Anyone else? Yes, right there at the back.
Just don't feel like praying.
Very good. I mean, you don't feel like talking to God or listening to Him either, isn't it? I found this so important. I think that is very important, a gauge. If you love someone, you'll spend time with them. And by the way, you won't find time, you'll make time. I remember when I was pastoring a church, Manoj was in love with Priya, one of our youth leaders, and her mom was pretty much concerned. And she said, Pastor Chris, she called me, she said, listen, I think you need to talk to my daughter. Those days we paid for the amount time we spent on the phone. You remember that? We actually paid for the time. And so he said, you need to talk to Priya because she's on the phone. And I asked her, what are you doing? And she says, I'm reviewing for my exams with my friend. She says, like for an hour late in the night? Now, I knew what she was reviewing because I knew Manoj. It's very interesting. And I said, I would ask Manoj, I said, Manoj, I'm not saying, but you don't have to be on the phone that late, and that's not helping your testimony, especially if our parents have to concur. In our country, we just don't fall in love. Our parents choose our partners. Dorothy, my father chose my wife for me. Made courtship very easy and less expensive. But when you think about, so you have to get a clearance, right? You got to get a clearance. And I said to him, I said, what did you all talk about? And he would say, we talked about the upcoming youth meeting. And I said, for 1 hour? That's like sweet nothings. But you know, when you're in love, you're not worried about the bill. You're not worried about the time. All you care for is the object of your love, to be in there. Isn't that true? Right? And I think that's a great symptom. I mean, for time's sake, I've just listed a few. Are we growing in our knowledge of God by actually loving others and seeing others either come to Christ or their joy being full? Another symptom, this commandment, do people see my life as obedience? Do they see that I am an obedient follower of Jesus Christ? I do some things, you know why? Because Jesus asked me to do them. This is very important. And the way I do it is not only because of obedience, but in total dependence and sacrifice. Love actually gives, and forgives, but it hurts because it costs. It's costly love. Here's another thing. Am I fulfilling the royal love? What are my concerns? Is it for the kingdom of God? And I'm including in this whole section not only just generosity or charity, but advocacy, seeking justice for the oppressed. Are these part of my kingdom concerns? I think that's also important in love. I lack in that area. And I had to examine, am I really a champion for those who are oppressed? Because I can love the lovely people. But what about those I don't like? What are ways I can stir one another in love and good works? When I'm in a team, or as faculty in the School of Divinity, or as a partner here in teaching partner, do I really meet with the others? And when we meet to plan, do I actually stir them up and say, hey, let's do this, let's do that? I enjoy our team meetings because we really kind of stir one another up. How do we do this? We learn from one another. We build on the other. We need to do that in families and in communities. So let me warn us of some of the counterfeits of love. Because it's there, but it's conditional and it disappears. You know, last Christmas, I gave you my heart. The very next day, never mind. So what happens when love is not genuine? It doesn't last. It doesn't endure. It's superficial, syrupy, and sentimental love. It is not self-sacrificing, and it certainly is not kenotic, emptying yourself for the good of others. Here's the first one, and if you haven't read C.S. Lewis' Four Loves, sell what you have, buy that book, and it's worth its weight in gold. It's really good. It talks about these four loves. But again, Whitney also has something, but I've adapted this. And here are 4 types of love in the Greco-Roman world that everybody knew. First had to do with natural love, Sturgo. But you know, this is something that even non-believers will have. And Luke says, listen, if you love those who only love you, what good is that? Even the pagans do that. It's easy for all the cheerleaders to sit together in the rot because, you know, we love each other. We're all into the same thing. You know? And all the computer geeks on the other side, you know, they're like, we are all same. You know, we kind of do this for one another. We talk about the same things. But I like to mix and mingle with those who are not like me, learn from them, have an input in their lives. And I know I'm talking to some people who will never leave the way you sit in church. I mean, my goodness. I was in a church in this country, and it was so warm. And the fans were there, but they were not put it on. But I noticed there was electricity. So I asked the pastor, I said, why aren't you putting the fans on? He said, well, those fans were donated. So I said, oh, is that interesting? So why don't you put it on? He says, if you notice, you can read the names on the wings of the fan. This was donated by. And he says, still we say the pastoral prayer for Thanksgiving. We don't put the fans on because we want everybody to know who donated that fan. You know, he says, is that what love is? Then there is this, what I call narcissistic love. And by the way, this word eros is not in the Bible. We get the word erotic, which is basically self-inflicted love. It's self-love. We ask the question, what's in it for me? Everything is about me, despicable me, part 3. You know, we say what I can get, make me feel good. And this is why I stopped counseling. I used to do a lot of marital, premarital, postmarital counseling. And I stopped because coming from India and my understanding of love, you see, in America, you usually marry the one you love, right? We love the one we marry, which is agape. And so when people come and say, she doesn't love me anymore, I'm thinking, what's that got to do with anything? No, seriously, when you think about self-sacrificial, voluntary love, and she does not love me anymore, so you stop loving her? So that is what's in it for me. I don't feel loved. So that is the narcissistic love, self-navel-gazing, what's in it for me. There's a third kind of love, which is phileo, but this is also like the city of Philadelphia, brotherly love. This is the non-commitmental social love. It's a kind of the quid pro quo, the 50-50. If you do this, I will love you. So it takes two hands to clap. What goes around comes around. And you're like, this is it. We are a very loving community. But if they mess with me, if they say anything, then I'm out of here. The fourth love, of course, is agape. And this is a love that only those in Christ who are new creations, 2 Corinthians 5:17, they are the ones who experience this love because it is the fruit of the Spirit. It's an outcome of Jesus' Spirit in us. It is selfless, it is sacrificial, it is compassionate. Now, there are three areas we can reflect, and I just want to leave you with this in terms of homework to think about it. In the Bible, we are clearly instructed to love believers. The early church had all kinds of problems. They were messed up. The early church also went through a lot of persecution. But people like Roman governors, even Pliny, when he wrote to the emperor, he said, these Christians are crazy people. They're into cannibalism. They eat flesh. They drink blood stuff. They're into all this incestuous. They call each other brother and sister. They're actually atheists. They don't worship any of our gods. But I tell you one thing about the early Christians, how they love one another. How they love one another. A pagan world could look at the incipient church and say one thing. There's a lot of things we don't understand about these people, but there's one thing we can't deny, how they love one another. Heritage, do you think people can say that of us? I mean, this church has all kinds of issues, but there's one thing, they love one another because they love Jesus. I think that's a distinguishing mark of belonging to Him. But again, don't forget, you love not only one another, I mentioned you love the lost. This love for those who are without Christ, our longing that they also experience that God so loved that He gave, that they participate in responding to His love. And then this whole emphasis, it's easy for us to love everybody. But isn't it true? Sometimes we neglect our own family. Dorothy often says that to me. Chris, did you notice how nice you are to people when they come home? But look how you tell your daughters, do the dishes, He says, what's wrong? It's like you're schizophrenic. You're like two different people. And again, sometimes we don't show that love to one another. To live above with saints we love, that'll be glory. To live below with some people we know, no, that's another story. We don't get along. But start at home. Why? The home is the laboratory of faith and love. That's where, because they know you not only the best, they know the worst about you. And that's why that's so important, to start at the unit of the church and community, which is the home. Paul wrote a lot about loving husbands and wives and so on. So I'll leave you with 1 John. Let's ask this disciple whom Jesus loved. Who's that? John. I like the way John is so selfless or self-evasive. He doesn't even say, I, John. Peter would have said, I, Simon Peter, John says, the disciple whom Jesus loved. I mean, really? Why can't you say, I ran to the tomb? Why the disciple whom... You notice, he is so selfless, he doesn't even talk about himself. In fact, very little quotation by John in the New Testament. What does John say? There's no quotation. And John said, we see Peter babbling. He had foot and mouth disease. Every time he opened his foot, he put his mouth in it. And Jesus said, Peter, you speak not knowing what you're saying. But John didn't say anything. But John leant on Jesus' breast, and he loved Jesus. He lingered at the cross. Jesus, keep me near the cross. John knew that. And not only did John love Jesus, Jesus loved John. You say, how do you know? I'll tell you what, I wouldn't entrust my mom to Peter. I mean, Peter denied Jesus. You know why? Because he healed his mother-in-law. Never mind. So we have all kinds of family problems. But when it came to, some of you just got it. So when it came to John, John was there to the very end. Peter followed afar. John was at the foot of the cross. And he takes Mary, Jesus' mother, with him to his home. Isn't that wonderful? A beautiful picture of love. Here is John writing, and you can read these verses later on. And by the way, I'll give you this. David, can we put this on the PowerPoint? I'm from Asia. Copyright means right to copy. So no, sorry. You can acknowledge this, but I'll give you these points. Here is how John says what love is. This is what love is. Do you love and let love have its way, or do you harbor hatred towards others? If you do not love your brother whom you see, if you hate your brother, don't say you love God. That's pretty strong. That's a good way. Diagnosis. Are you ready? Are we doing that? Put the stethoscope. Do I really harbor hatred? Or do I naturally love and forgive? Secondly, John says, do you love the world? And by the way, this is apophatic. What is apophatic? I don't know. It sounds nice, so I used it. No. Apophatic is to negate something, to define something by what it is not. It's called apophatic. So this is what love is not. If you love the world, John says, 1 John chapter 5, and he says very clearly in verse 15, love not the world. Did you know we are never asked to love the world? This shocked me when I studied this. Never once does God say love the world. Now, God loves the world, but we are not to love the world. Why? He explains. Because the cosmos he's talking is not the humanity that God loves. It is the way of the world which is anti-Christ and his way. Love not the world, neither the things of the world, that all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but of the world. And the world is what? Passing away and all this less. But whosoever does the will of the Lord endures for, that is love. Love endures forever. Great test for diagnosis. Another thing says, do you long to assemble as God's people? Do you love the brethren? Do you say, can we get, what a thrill and a feeling when we get together as God's wonderful people? Do you love the fellowship? I mean, I've got some people in our church in Chantilly. They are so used to now e-church. They're still in their PJs watching service. Like, I don't know, I got to wear masks. I mean, do you long for these gatherings? Do you strive towards righteousness and hate sin? Do you love just in words? Or do you love in deed, action? Is it accompanied by action and deeds? I think these are checklists. Think about it. Take it home. But here's a verse, I think, which is critical. Paul is writing to a church that's very legalistic, and they are arguing about the law. And these were the Gauls, the Galatians. When Rome conquered a place, did you know that 1/3 of the population Rome enslaved under Pax Romana? They made them slaves to show we're in control. But when it came to Galatia, are you ready? They enslaved 9/10 of the population because they didn't trust these fellows. They were horrible, uncouth people. And they had come to Christ, some of them. And Paul writes this letter. And some of these Judaizers are saying, well, get them circumcised. You know what he says? This is in Galatians 5 and verse 6. He says, what ultimately matters? What's in the final analysis? I love that. In the final analysis, there's only one thing that matters. Faith expressing itself in love. I love that phrase. This is what matters. Church, the bottom line. We can sit and argue over all kinds of theological degrees, all kinds of practical ways in which we demonstrate faith, the do's and don'ts. But listen, Paul says, you know the bottom line, the final analysis, is your faith expressing itself in love? And so that is the fruit we need to cultivate. And I pray that today, as a result of this diagnosis, I hope I've given us some instruments, some tools to kind of put the stethoscope near our hearts and say, Lord, do I love you with everything I've got? Lord, is this love for you growing more and more? Am I demonstrating this love to others practically? It's like that couple who went for counseling and they had some marital problems. And after listening to both sides, the counselor said to the husband, listen, the problem is very simple. All your wife needs is a little TLC. He said, well, what is TLC? He said, well, TLC is tender, loving care. He said, I don't understand. I told her I love her when I married. If I change my mind, I'll let her know. What is this? TLC. Well, the counselor said, you need to show that love every day. He said, I still don't understand. So he said, what do you mean? So the counselor said, I'll show you since you asked me. So he stoops at the table, pulls this guy's wife, kisses her, and puts her back. And he says, see, this is what she needs every day. He says, you know, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday I can bring her, but Tuesday, Thursday, she's got to come on her own. You know, honestly, our understanding and diagnosis of love is so far-fetched that we must have a regular checkup. Is this a distinguishing mark? Peter, do you love me? Do you love me more than this? And here's my pointers. Let the fire of the Father's love warm our hearts so that we can love like he did, the prodigal father. Third, delight in imitating Jesus. Love embodied, that came down, that gave himself on the cross. And evidence that love indeed to show that you're a disciple. Number 4, would you identify specific and practical ways you have a relationship that is lacking in love? Maybe you need to send a text today or write a letter or an email. Or just go visit someone and say, listen, I just came to spend time. I have no agenda. I just want to have a cup of tea with you. And finally, take the initiative to love unconditionally, just the way that God loved us. This week, we are celebrating the love of God. What held Jesus on the cross? Not those rugged nails. He could have ripped that off. It was his love for you and me. Church, when I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss and pour contempt on all my pride. Where the whole realm of nature mine, 'twere for an offering far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. God bless you.
Thank you so much. Pray that you guys have a great night and that you find not only a greater awareness of the love of God for you, but how you can better show it to others. We'll see you next week.